And welcome back. We are now on the second session of our morning. That's the final installment of the GTech 2022 Winter School. And show us some love, as we said on social media, hashtag GTech Winter School 2022. And if you really want to get all the good news and all the information, be so kind and follow us, in particular on LinkedIn, by searching for GTech South Africa. This session will focus on the basic service delivery and in-depth analysis of the community survey. This is a survey that was done a few years ago that gives a good sense of how our state of affairs are, and will be repurposed again or released again once the census data is finalized. And joining us this morning is Niel, Roux, Service Delivery Statistics at Stats SA. Just a bit about Niel. Niel is a director of service delivery statistics in Statistics South Africa, otherwise known as Stats SA. This section, or his section, is primarily responsible to lead the implementation of the annual General Household Survey, known as GHS, across all stages of statistical value chain, and to use other Stats SA survey and administrative data sources to explore basic service delivery in the country. Niel is not alone. Niel is with Casment Mahlwele. Casment Mahlwele is also joining from the same room with Niel, I understand. And Casmet is a deputy director for service delivery in Statistics South Africa, and is currently there working key performance areas that include dissemination of service delivery statistics, stakeholder engagement, as well as development of surveys and instruments. And they'll take us through for the next 45 minutes on how this entail and how this impact our understanding of service delivery as we know it. After this, we'll go to a 10 minutes a break for all of us that need to have some comfort. And good morning, Niel.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning also from Casment's side, who's sitting next to me. He'll join you on the screen just after the first section.
Good to have you, Niel, and you can take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me just quickly share the presentation. Okay, I hope you can all see the presentation. If somebody can just show me a thumbs up. Oh, that's great. Yes, as the introduction said, my name is Niel Roux. I'm from Statistics South Africa. I'll be joined by my colleague, Casment Mahlwele. We're in a section called Service Delivery Statistics that looks particularly at surveys in Statistics South Africa and what we can learn from them in terms of service delivery. Today we'll be presenting a report on the Community Survey 2016, which we actually released a number of years ago, and which is due to be, I guess, re-released as a census version, hopefully, by next year or so, depending on when the census data becomes available. Okay, now I just need to be able to move. Okay, I think the very first thing that's important, and of course all of you know this, is that municipalities are really the most basic units of governance. And that municipalities are important in the sense that they provide the most basic coalface services to the population, be it water and electricity that we're going to talk about today, or various other services like refuse removal, for instance. And these, of course, fundamental building blocks to everyday life. And therefore, I think it's very important that we understand that local government should be understood in terms of not only service delivery, but people's access to service delivery, or households in particular, access to service delivery. Sorry, I've got this relationship. There you go. Okay, the very first thing we wanted to do was just to give you guys a very quick update on where do we get data on service delivery. In Statistics South Africa, there are three main sources of survey data that we have. The first one is, of course, census data. We also mentioned the community survey data, and then the last one will be our normal household surveys, our regular household surveys, like the general household survey, the income expenditure survey, and maybe the quarterly labor force survey. Both of these has got pros and cons, or benefits or disadvantages. Now, the census, of course, was first done, at least in post-apartheid years, was first done in 1996. It was followed by a census in 2001, 2011, and then in 2022, which is the one that was done earlier this year, but which was delayed by COVID. Now, one would realize that the benefits of a census is that it covers the whole geography. In other words, from the lowest levels to the highest levels, and also the whole country as a whole. In other words, nothing in principle is excluded. And also, it means that we can produce estimates at the lowest possible levels. In principle, we can produce estimates at the enumerator area, which is the very smallest area. For those of you who don't know census geography, enumerator area is a cluster of about 100 households or dwelling units. In other words, it's just big enough to be covered by a single enumerator. That's one person that gathers all this data. And that's extremely small in statistical terms. The disadvantages, of course, is because it's so expensive. It's a huge undertaking. Somebody said, census is the biggest undertaking outside of wartime. It is something that we cannot afford to do every year or even every 5 years, as we originally meant to do. So a census is decennial. It only takes place every 10 years, which means that we have to reproduce some of the data in another way. The way we do it in Stats South Africa is we do what we call an intercensal census, or a survey, which is the community survey. The community survey is a larger survey than our normal surveys. You'll see that the last one was about 1.4 million households. And it takes place basically midway between the two censuses to provide you with information on household services and the general population, socioeconomic status, and so forth. So advantages, of course, are that you can go down to local, district, municipality level. Your questionnaires are also a bit more expanded, so you can go into extensive modules. But the disadvantages, of course, also they are decennial. Okay. I see I just need to stop sharing. It's going to be shared from the other side. So we will just go and do that. Right. So they're just gonna share it from their side. Let me just stop sharing here. And then, of course, the benefit, of course, is that at least you're providing with some level of data. The other source of data that we do have is the normal annual surveys that we have. And we are running, if you go to the next slide. Yes, this one. As you can see, the other surveys that we have is what we call our annual surveys in Statistics South Africa. These are surveys of household samples of about 30,000, which are still huge in international terms. But unfortunately, the samples doesn't really allow us to provide statistically significant data at a local municipality or a district municipality level. To do that, for instance, our samples, depending on our stratifications, will probably have to be 4 times as large, about 120,000, if not more. So as a consequence, we can provide data, for instance, up to a metro level, which we've been doing since 2015. We can have extensive questionnaires, in other words, that can really bore into some service delivery issues. But the data is limited to the extent that it can really assist people at local governance to really identify pockets, for instance, of poverty, poor services, etc. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the community survey really had 5 objectives. The first 2 objectives is really to get estimates on the total number of population and households in the various local municipalities and district municipalities that we had. Then also to get a sense of demographic change, that is fertility, mortality, and migration in each of these areas. Those are the things that are really being used to model population and household growth and change. Also to measure socioeconomic factors. Those are employment, education, and so forth. And then finally, to measure access to facilities and basic services. And these include water, sanitation, electricity, ICT, and so forth. Next slide, please. A bit more about the community survey. It was done in March 2016. Our census night was actually the 6th and 7th of March. That's what we call a reference night. It's also one of the first surveys that introduced CAPI, that's computer-assisted personal interviews. In other words, we used electronic tablets instead of paper questionnaires, which were scanned later on. Our target population, very similar to our normal household surveys, was really all non-institutionalized populations. In other words, we didn't look at people in jails, old age homes, hospitals, and so forth. And then, like I've mentioned earlier, our sample is about 1.4 million, and we covered about 93,000 of the 115,000 EAs that we had in a census. So it was a very widely distributed sample as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so what was the purpose of the study we did? One of the things that we've realized by looking at the GHS over the years is that there's been tremendous improvement in access to services across all provinces, to water and to sanitation and to various other things. However, we've reached a point over the last few years that there seems to be a stagnation in terms of improvement. Some backlogs persist. In other words, the percentage of households that doesn't get access to electricity and water, regardless of what has been done. And what we try to do with this data is to try and identify where are those places, and to maybe also identify the reasons for this persisting backlogs. Next slide, please. Okay, this all of you would know. This is the basis of our analysis. We used the 5 categories here of municipalities to really identify or to classify our analysis with. A being your metro municipalities, your B1 being your bigger secondary cities, and then you go down until you get to B4, which is really your rural municipalities. And you'll see a very nice correlation developing, well, not a very nice, but a very clear correlation perhaps developing between these municipalities and their various levels of development and underdevelopment inversely. Next slide, please. Now, this is really presenting geographically these municipalities. Now, I think important is just to stop here for a second and just point out something. At the time of the community survey, we had 278 municipalities, of which 8 were metros, 44 were district municipalities, and about 226 were local municipalities. There has, of course, been some legislative and demarcation changes since then, and some municipalities have been created by combining them. And also, in some cases, small parts of some municipalities have moved to other ones. And this is really one of the things that also makes it difficult over time to really compare these municipalities. In a sense that demarcation changes can sometimes make it very, very difficult over time to compare apples to apples. There's also been some name changes, which sometimes makes it tricky. But, you know, I think on a whole, this is probably still a very useful analysis. Just 2, I think, main points here to make. Your brown spots here are the 8 metros, of course, Cape Town, Nelson Mandela, Buffalo City, and then, of course, the 3 in Gauteng and eThekwini. And then the yellow ones, which is the light ones, are really your B4 municipalities. Those are your deep rural municipalities, which I'll talk to in the next slide again. So we can go to the next slide, please. Now, this is a slide that was developed using SAMPI methodology. This is the South African multiple poverty indicators. So instead of just looking at money-metric poverty, in other words, people who don't have enough money, it looks at a range of variables which could be used to identify poverty in particular communities. The thing I wanted to show you was, if you think of the previous slide, and particularly where your poorer municipalities, your B4 municipalities were located, you'll also see by looking at this that your poorest areas, which is your red areas, as well as your orange areas, actually overlaps many of those B4 areas. So if you look at the wraparound going all the way from Eastern Cape, where you've got your deep red, in other words, this is really your deep poverty areas, all the way to northern KwaZulu-Natal, then the yellow, which is slighter, your red on the top of Limpopo, and then wrapping around to the top of Northwest. Now that, of course, holds a lot of implications for what service delivery can take place and what populations can actually contribute. Coincidentally, also those areas are mostly, of course, rural, which makes it more expensive to provide services because there are far distances, it's technically difficult, etc. So I think this is one of the slides you have to keep in mind also when you think about service delivery in South Africa. Next slide, please. The next thing we have to look at, except for poverty, of course, is really a kind of a sense of density. Now, this particular slide provides information for 2011 census as well as 2016 community survey on two axes. On the one hand, we try to give you a sense of how households, which are really our main users of services, are distributed across the various municipal categories. And the second one, and that's the blue line essentially, we try to give a sense of the population or the household growth between 2011 and 2016 as a straight line growth. Okay, so if you have a look at firstly the proportional distribution, you'll find that 45% of the total number of households in the country essentially lived in metropolitan areas. Now, South Africa is largely a urbanized country already. More than 60%, 65% of our population live in urban areas. And of course, that's also growing as migration increases. But also, if you look at this one, you'll see that about, on the other side, about 20%, 1/5 of the households rather, lived in B4 municipalities. Now, there's a small difference, of course, between those. If you have a look at the nature of households, you'll find that your households in the metropolitan areas are often smaller households, many one-person households, much more mobile, much more migrants, many of them in informal areas. Whilst in your B4 municipalities, it's slightly different. It might be much larger, extended families, but also you do get your single-person migrants, high mobility, and so forth. So there are also qualitative changes. The other thing that, and the last point I want to make here is that if you have a look at your A municipalities, your metros, you'll find that population or household growth in the 5 years between 2011 and 16 combined to about 20%. In other words, there was a 20% increase in the total number of households. And that's compared to only about 6% in your B4 metros. So that shows you that most of the growth, not only in that period, but also, I believe, going forward, is actually going to be in your bigger municipalities, including your secondary cities and so forth, as one would expect. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's quickly talk about water services. I'm going to do the water services part and a very, very quick surgeon through sanitation, and then my colleague is going to take over and take you out for the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, this is something you all know, but I think it's always important to just put it in there to remind ourselves why what we are doing is so important. Sections 24 and 27 of the Bill of Rights, of course, grant specific rights to the access to sufficient water. And then Section 27 provides that everyone has the right to have access to sufficient water. And importantly, that the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of these rights. Now, this is the easy part. From this point onwards, it gets, of course, much more difficult because of a lot of historical debt that we are carrying, or and also just geographical differences and problems that we have in realizing this. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things we do is by looking at survey data. We're looking at the access that individuals have to certain resources, be it water or sanitation, electricity. And that, of course, will also inversely gives us an idea of what the infrastructure is that people have got access to. Now, of course, this could have changed a lot since 2016, although one of the things that I've learned over time is that on aggregate, you find very slow changes. Many of these changes are often at very small levels, but your aggregate level changes very, very slowly. So what do we see looking at a CS? We see as a start that about 90% of all households had access to some kind of pipe water. Of course, not all of it the same quality. If we have a look at where, we see that about 64% had access to water in the dwelling, 50% in the yards, and 13% used the communal tap. However, the important thing here is about 4.3% or so actually had access, didn't have access at all, or no improved access. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a geographical distribution. Again, the darker area shows you where the access was best. The lighter areas, again, overlapping the B4 municipalities, shows you where access was worst. And this is looking at your improved water, which is the blue block on the bottom. And as you can see, essentially 98% in 78 municipalities, about 98% of all dwellings had access to improved water. Our big challenge and our big concern is that less than 50% of households had access to improved water in about 20 municipalities, of which 11 was in Eastern Cape and 9 in KwaZulu-Natal. And then if you look at where the lowest access was, you could see it also indicated on the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just, again, a very brief overview, just showing you how it's distributed. As you can see, water inside a dwelling is much more common in metropolitan areas, but inversely on the other side of the scale, either having no water or having water in the outside yard is much higher in your B4 municipalities. Next slide, please. This is your backlog. Your backlog is really your inverse of having access. And you can see your about 27.5% of households in your B4 municipalities didn't have water, compared to about 1.5% in your metropolitan municipalities. I must just very quickly caution here to say that one must keep into consideration here, of course, that by far 45% of your population, or your households rather, reside in metropolitan areas. So this 1.5% is still very, very significant. And of course, it's also a moving target, which it's something we can maybe talk about a bit later. Next slide, please. This is just a distribution of where people get water from, or their households. As you can see in your A municipalities, much of this comes from municipalities themselves. So this is clear water that's provided by the municipality. And the municipality as a provider of water then declines, as you move to smaller municipalities, until you get to a point where you can find that a municipality only provides a relatively small proportion of water in your B4s. However, what's important there is that in your B4 municipalities, up to about a fifth of households used streams, rivers, and other sources of water. So that, I think, is also very important, and which we also show in the next slide a bit. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, we really identified the households where the municipalities in which the highest percentage of households didn't have access to improved water. And as you can find here, this is in Kuza Hill, Mbizana, and so forth. We find that up to 75% of households had to use water from streams, rivers, pools, dams, and other standing sources, which is, of course, completely unhealthy. Now, these, of course, are relatively small populations, but the fact that so many households have to rely on these unhealthy sources, if I can call it that, or these risky sources, shows you how difficult it is to provide, not only provide services, but provide services which you can actually maintain over time. Because that, in our estimation, is also becoming the next important thing, is maintenance of existing infrastructure. Next slide, please. So water reliability was also a question we asked about. In other words, whether households experienced any kind of water interruptions during the period, the previous 3 days or so, or 3 months rather. And we can see here that water interruptions were much more common in your more rural and also your poorer provinces, Northwest Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape. But inversely, of course, then it was much lower in your A municipalities and much higher in your B4 municipalities, as you can see there. So interruptions was most common in Big 5, which I believe is now called the Big 5 Glabisa, which is close to Glooi. And then it was least common in Baviaans and so forth. Now, of course, this situation could have changed in the last 5 years, but it gives you a very good indication and was relatively consistent over time. Next slide, please. Your reliability, of course, also influences your perceptions. And as you can see here, your households, your metropolitan households were much happier your metropolitan municipalities were much more approving of the services than your B4 municipalities. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a very, very quick slide. We're just going to show 2 of them. We created what we call the Infrastructure Quality Index, again, inversely looking at the quality of services based on the access that individual households had, because it's much more difficult to really go to the ground and identify what infrastructure is available. So we have the 5 levels here, which is non-minimal, intermediate, and full. And we identified in each household on basically on what they had, and we graphed it geographically. So next slide, please. And as you can see here, it basically gives us a very similar picture to what you have seen before. Your darker areas is where your access is much higher. Those would be your Western Cape, Northern Cape areas. And then also kind of a spine going up to Gauteng. And then your B4 municipalities, your poorer municipalities that really runs around from the Northwest all the way to Eastern Cape, have much poorer access, which is also where you've got poorer infrastructure quality. Next slide, please. This is just basically showing this in a graph format, just repeating what I've said. Your Western Cape really have got a full access, and then your lowest level of full access would be in Limpopo province. And then in between, you've got various levels of intermediate access. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, very briefly through sanitation services, just because it's linked. If we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so improved sanitation are really 2 things in South Africa. The one would be flush toilets, and the other one would be ventilated pipe toilets. Now, in South Africa, I would have liked to say that the majority of households are probably flush toilets. But the reality is that a lot of the improvement that we've done, particularly in places like the Eastern Cape, has really been ventilated pipe toilets. So there's not a clear correlation between access to water and improved sanitation. Next slide, please. But as you can see here, about 75.5% of households, according to the CS, had access to improved sanitation. But I think at the bottom, it's improved to say that about 13.7% used pipe or ventilated or non-ventilated toilets, as well as then 2.4% of households say that had actually no toilets at all. So those blue dots that you see there, and those are really where you get your biggest backlog in terms of households that didn't have improved forms of sanitation. Next slide, please. This is just confirming it, mostly in your B4 municipalities. About 50% of households said they didn't have adequate access. Next slide, please. And then, this is also just the quality. This is people who had facilities, but it was outside a yard. In other words, they had to walk there physically, which is also sometimes indicative of inadequate access. Next slide, please. Okay, so the perception of sanitation services, much better, I guess, but also, as you can see, it's probably a bit better in your metropolitan and municipalities where services are more affordable, more densely populated, more money and better planning available than in your B4 municipalities, where, of course, people live much more dispersed and it's much more difficult to provide centralized services. Okay, next slide, please. And then basically this just shows you exactly what we had with water, just in terms of sanitation. So again, you've got your spine where you've got better services running up from the Western Cape through Free State, essentially up to Gauteng, and then it's skirted on the northern and easternmost boundaries by your poorer municipalities where services are much worse, unfortunately, and access to services are much worse. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to introduce my colleague Casment Mahlwele now to do electricity services. And here is Casment then. Just allow me to quickly skip out, please. You've got about 12 minutes. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Niel. Morning, colleagues. I'm going to do electricity services and solid waste management, then conclusion. Next slide, please. In terms of NDP target, we are planning that households should have access to grid, 90% of households should have access to grid electricity by 2030, and the remaining 10% non-grid, basically leaving no one behind. Next one. Thank you. We said that municipalities are given powers and authority to distribute electricity to their residents. Thank you. Next one. Yeah, I think my colleague Niel presented a lot on CS. We decided to include one on the current date is GHS 2021. It's a time series from 2002 to 2021 in terms of access to mains electricity. And we see that most households, about 7 of the 9 provinces, they've already reached the target of 90%. Or the only problem is in 2 provinces, which is your Northwest and Gauteng. But if you look at Northwest, basically the main contributor there, it's because there are a lot of informal settlement. And if you look at Gauteng, it's in terms of in-migration and probably growth. Thank you. Next one. Then the next slide is energy used for cooking. If you look in terms of electricity, there's been an increase in terms of energy used for cooking in terms of electricity between 2002 and 2021 from 57.5% to 77%. We also see a decline in terms of use of wood and paraffin, and we notice a smaller increase in terms of use of gas for cooking. Thank you. Next one. We look at a percentage of households access electricity by province and municipal categories using CS. The previous 2 services were really similar in terms of access, but if you look at electricity, it's almost a bit different because you look at your B4 municipalities, 86% have got access to electricity. B3, same 86, and then if you look at B2, it's 86, and then your category A and B municipalities is 89. So there's just a difference of 3% between the municipalities. Next one. We look in terms of backlog. The largest backlog in terms of electricity is in most municipalities in your KZN, Mahlwele, Lingana, Josini, Maphumulo, Mpangeni, and Msinga. Next one. Thank you. Now we look at in terms of households where they receive electricity, whether it's municipalities or Eskom. If you look at the darker green colors, it's basically where Eskom provides electricity. And then if you look at the bigger dots, it's where it's Eskom, and we see that mainly Eskom provide electricity to your rural municipalities or rural provinces, and your urban and affluent provinces is basically municipalities. Okay, thank you. Main supply of electricity in the 8 metropolitan municipalities, we see that in terms of in Nelson Mandela, a higher percentage that they get electricity from municipality. If you look at the city of Cape Town, it's basically municipality and Eskom. And again, if you look at city of Tshwane, it's similar. There is a portion that gets electricity from Eskom and the other one from municipality. Next one, please. Reliability of electricity services. Again, the darker the color, it means the electricity is not reliable. And again, we can see it's in your rural municipalities where they say electricity is not reliable. If you look at metros and also district municipalities, they are somehow happy in terms of reliability of electricity. Next one.
This was in 2016, of course.
Yeah. If we look at a perception of electricity services, again, remember that electricity is widespread. So you'll see that suddenly people in your P4 municipalities, they are more happier, or they rate the electricity as good compared to your municipalities. So in terms of metros, they were least satisfied, and more satisfied were your rural municipalities, particularly B3 and B4 municipalities. Next one. Thank you. Like we did with the previous two services, we did electricity service infrastructure quality. And again, this one, it almost follows the same distribution. The darker the color, it means the quality index is higher, and the lighter the color, the index is a bit lower. Again, you see somehow there are some places where in Limpopo where they pop up again in some rural areas. It's only because electricity is widespread. And I'm gonna run fast through the next one, which is solid waste management. Next one. Again, if you look at South Africa, about 60% of households, their refuse is removed at least 1 week, at least once per week. If you look at own refuse dump, it's about 30%. And again, the remaining options, they account for about 11%. Next one, please. Solid waste disposal service, in terms of there is a standard that is used by DEA now, DFFE, Department of Fishery, Forestry and Environment. So they are customizing the removal of solid waste in terms of the options of that particular municipality. So if you are in rural area, if you do own them, they consider that as a good one. So you see that the figures increases when we use their standard, and again, especially in rural municipalities and your smaller towns. But there's a little increase in terms of metros and secondary towns. Next one, please. Perception of solid waste services, again, it depends on whether the service is available or not. You can see that now in metros, they are a bit happier, and again, your B4 and B3 municipalities, because the service is normally not available, so their ratings are a bit lower. Thank you. Next one, please. Like we did with the previous three services, we did a solid waste infrastructure quality index. This one, the distribution is the same as water and sanitation. As we see that the index is very low for your rural municipalities and high for your urban municipalities, particularly metros. Next one, please. In conclusion, next one. Now we've presented the four infrastructure indices, but if you take average of the four, and then we get what is called composite service index score. So we'll take the score for water, score for electricity, score for sanitation, and score for solid waste management, and take the average, and then we get the composite service delivery index score. Again, they follow the same distribution as the previous four, where higher services are distributed in the urban provinces, and again, the poor ones are in your poor municipalities, your B4 and B3 municipalities. So it's the same as water and sanitation, slightly different to electricity, but again, equivalent to solid waste management. Next one. We ask a question about perception of services in CS 2016, we remember that when people are not satisfied, it leads to service protest. So we just want to see how happy or satisfied people are with the service. Next one. Household in metropolitan municipalities were most concerned about that is electricity. And if you look at the second one, it's employment opportunities. And and if you look at in terms of households in your B1 to B4 municipalities, they were really worried about reliability of water and safety of water, even the access to water. Next one. Now we just decided to take a few of the options that were mentioned in terms of problems of difficulty with municipalities. So what we want to show here is that the problems are unique to municipalities. If you look at lack of safe or reliable water supply, it's a concern for rural municipalities, but not really a concern for metropolitan municipalities. Cost of water, no one seems to be worried about that. If you look at lack of reliable electricity supplier, it's also a small percentage. But now household in metropolitan municipalities, they are worried about cost of electricity, but rural municipalities is only 3%, not so worried about it. Inadequate road, it's 11.3% in rural municipalities, and in terms of metros, it's only 5.4, meaning that they are not worried about rural inadequate roads. Next one. Now, we've seen the problems that people they've mentioned, but now we ask a question: do you think municipalities will do anything about problems that you mentioned? If you say you are worried about high electricity cost, are they going to do something? If you are worried about employment, are they going to create employment? Yeah, unfortunately, 75% of household did not believe that municipalities were trying to solve the problem or difficulty they have identified. The figure is relatively consistent across all municipal categories. I think the last one should be thank you. Next one. Yeah, it's thank you. On behalf of Niel and myself, thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Casment, and thank you, Niel, for such a great presentation. They're giving us quite insight on some of the numbers that you've been crunching over the years, and it shows the diligence that you take when it comes to looking at some of our statistics and relating them to service delivery. So we thank you profusely for your dedication, taking some time off to really be with us at the 2022 GTech Winter School. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, there are a few questions. There's maybe let me take one question before we jump into a break. Someone is shooting from all the cylinders here. I can tell you that for free, and that's Silo Raymond Maleke, and he's asking here, which is very straightforward question, really. Does Stats SA form part of budgetary planning in municipalities?
Maybe using a data.
Remember, at Stats SA, we only provide statistics from dates for policymakers to use them. But now, National Treasury do use our data in terms of budgetary, because they will say municipal X maybe deserve to get this much based on the numbers that we produce in Stats SA.
Oh, that's good. And talking about treasury, someone from the Northwest Provincial Treasury, in fact, not someone, Riabetswe Boche, asking which variables were used for water and sanitation. She's asking live from Northwest Provincial Treasury.
No, we used like for sanitation, we used flush toilets and VIP. For improved sanitation. For water, we looked at piped water in the house, piped water in the dwelling, and I think we also looked at neighbors' tap and even at distance, less than 200 kilometers.
Meters.
Yeah, less than 200 meters.
They can contact us.
But yeah,
All right, thank you.
For more information, they can really contact us. I think we'll share our details.
There you go, Riabetswe. You get in touch with the colleagues, Casment, as well as Niel from Stats SA. Any parting shots from you, Casment, before we close the session?
No, we really appreciate the opportunity that we're given, and we are really sad that we missed the previous 5, but we will make it up, and in the next one, we will be there definitely next year. But we really wish we could have been there for the previous 5 one also, GTech. Thank you very much.
Look, tell you what, we do receive your apology and accept it, and we'll hold you to it for the next session. All
No,
right.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was Niel, Roux and Casment Mahlwele, all from Statistics South Africa, an agency that helps us to collect data and ensure that we get all the planning, fiscal planning and service delivery planning ahead in time and is done well. So we're going to go for a quick 10 minutes break. We'll see you in about 10:45 or so. Join the session that follows next. We have quite a nice lined up speakers. A surprise appearance was made in the studio. As I said earlier on, I will be alone, but someone just said, you know what, I can't wait. I want to join you. So one of our speakers will be presenting live from our studios here with other speakers joining us online. So you don't want to miss this one. It's quite a nice session that speaks about not only service delivery, but how can you sustain service delivery, which I think is key. Building a clinic without a road is never a good plan. So you need to build services, or you need to deliver services that are quite sustainable in a short to long run. So you don't want to miss that one. We're going to have it in the next 10 minutes. So see you in 10 minutes time.